The station Orville hung in the dead space between three-star systems like a jewel no one could agree belonged to. It was neutral ground by ancient treaty, maintained by the Council's collective funding, and visited only when the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy needed to pretend they could stand each other's company. The 400th Interspecies Peace Summit had been announced 18 months in advance. Every species with a seat on the Galactic Council had sent delegations numbering in the dozens, advisors, translators, cultural liaisons, security details that bristled with quiet menace. The Velkari alone had sent 62 representatives, their cobalt-scaled bodies draped in ceremonial fiber that shifted color with their mood. Today, those fibers were gold, confident, dominant, certain of outcome. Humanity sent 3 people. Ambassador Yara Osai walked into the grand chamber of Orville with the kind of stillness that made other species uncomfortable. She was tall, unhurried, and dressed in a dark charcoal suit that bore no medals, no insignia, no ceremonial markings of any kind. Behind her walked Deputy Ambassador Ren Calloway, a lean man with a quiet face and eyes that missed nothing, and Dr. Sable Mwangi, humanity's chief treaty analyst, who carried a single data tablet and nothing else. 3 humans, for the summit that would decide the next century of galactic politics. The chamber was extraordinary, a vast circular hall carved from the station's original asteroid body, its ceiling open to a transparent steel dome that framed the stars above like a painting. 17 species sat at 17 curved tiers arranged in a great arc. Each tier was elevated slightly above the one below, a subtle architectural reminder of who had been in space the longest. Humanity's tier was at the bottom. They had been told this was alphabetical. It was not. Osai sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked up at the arc of alien faces above her. She did not look small. She looked like someone who had arrived exactly where she intended to be. The Council's presiding voice, an ancient Drenni named Chorus of 17, opened the summit with a 4-hour recitation of galactic history. It was customary. It was also, every species understood, a way of reminding the younger races how long everyone else had been doing this. The Velkari's fibers shimmered with quiet satisfaction throughout. Humanity listened. When the formal presentations began, the Velkari Dominion went first, as they always did. Their lead ambassador, a creature named Sarathvel, unspooled a proposed treaty framework that was dressed in the language of cooperation and mutual security, but was, at its architecture, something else entirely. New shipping lane designations, revised patrol boundaries, a tiered system of developmental oversight for species under 3 centuries old in space. Humanity had been spacefaring for 211 years. Osai made notes. Calloway watched the room. Mwangi's fingers moved quietly over the data tablet, cross-referencing every clause against a database that had taken her team 4 years to build. When Sarathvel finished, there was a murmur of polite agreement from the upper tiers. The Sorathi offered a gentle amendment to one minor clause. The Atren Confederacy nodded their heavy heads in approval. Nobody asked humanity anything. Nobody expected them to object. Young species never objected. They were grateful to be included. Osai closed her notebook, looked up at the dome full of stars, and felt the weight of what she'd read settle into her bones. She had read the full treaty framework the night before, not the summary, not the brief her staff had prepared. All 900 pages in the original Velkari legal dialect, cross-translated against 4 different interpretive engines to make sure nothing was lost. She had found it on page 340, buried in a subsection titled Provisional Stabilization Mechanisms. Article 71. She didn't say anything that evening. She thanked the Council's hospitality staff for the dinner, returned to the human quarters, and sat with Calloway and Mwangi until well past midnight. They dressed it nicely, Calloway said. They always do, Osai replied. Mwangi set her tablet down. What do we do? Osai was quiet for a long time. Outside the porthole, stars drifted past in slow silence, stars that humans had been reaching for since before they had words for the wanting. We do what we came here to do, she said. We find out if this is a negotiation or a performance. The next morning, they went back to the table. The second session began with the kind of procedural brightness that characterized council summits, careful language, diplomatic smiles, the elaborate theater of species who had been performing cooperation for centuries. The chamber hummed with translated murmurs as delegates conferred with their staff. Refreshments specific to each species' biology had been arranged with meticulous care. Everything was designed to feel like progress. Ambassador Os waited until the room had settled. Then she placed a single printed page on the table in front of her. One page, face up, with a section of text circled in red ink, actual red ink, from an actual pen, which in an age of digital annotation was so unusual that the delegates nearest to her tier actually leaned forward to look. She pressed a button on her console, and the page was projected onto the chamber's central display for all 17 species to see. Article 71, in plain galactic common, 3 paragraphs long. "I'd like to discuss this," she said. Her voice was conversational, unhurried, like someone bringing up a topic at a dinner table. Article 71, the Provisional Species Clause, stated, in language carefully softened by legal artistry, that any spacefaring civilization under 3 centuries old and operating within Council-adjacent space would be required to place their autonomous defense systems under joint Council oversight for a period of no less than 150 years. The stated reason was stability. The stated benefit was protection. What it meant, stripped of its diplomatic clothing, was this: Earth's defense grid, every orbital station, every patrol vessel, every weapons system humanity had built, would be handed to a committee of species who had just spent 4 hours yesterday reminding the galaxy how much older and wiser they were. Osai let the room read it. Then she asked, clearly and without aggression, "Does this clause apply to any other species currently seated at this table?" Silence. Not the thoughtful silence of people considering an answer. The tight, airless silence of people who had not expected the question. Sarathvel's fibers shifted, a flicker of amber, which in Velkari biology indicated surprise rapidly being managed. "The clause applies to civilizations at a certain developmental stage," he said carefully. "It is not species-specific." "But no other species at this table is at that stage," Osai said. "So in practice, it applies to one species, us. It is a framework for future members as well." "Is there a sunset provision?" Mwangi asked from her seat, not looking up from her tablet. "A review mechanism, a process by which humanity could petition to exit the oversight arrangement before 150 years. Another silence. "There was not." Calloway leaned forward slightly. "Who on the oversight committee would have veto power over Earth's defense decisions?" Sarathvel began a careful answer involving rotating chairmanships and consensus mechanisms. Osai listened to all of it. She waited until he had finished. She waited a moment more after that. Then she looked around the room, at the Sorathi, who were watching her with their 6 pale eyes, at the Atren, who had gone very still at Chorus of 17, whose drenny harmonics had dropped to an almost inaudible register. "I want to be fair to this room," she said. "So I want to ask one more time, plainly, is there any representative here who believes this clause, as written, is equitable?" Nobody spoke. It was not that they disagreed. Several of them, Osai suspected, privately found the clause distasteful. But the Velkari were powerful, and the treaty had momentum, and the summit had a schedule, and young species were expected to absorb small injustices gracefully and be thankful for the table. Osai nodded slowly. She closed her folder, capped her pen, straightened the single page on the table and placed it neatly back into her document case. Then she buttoned the top button of her jacket, a small, precise gesture, and stood. "Thank you for your hospitality," she said. "The food has been excellent. The accommodations were comfortable. We appreciate the council's invitation." She looked once more at the chamber. "We'll see ourselves out." She turned and walked toward the exit. Calloway and Mwangi were already standing. They fell into step behind her without a word, without a backward glance, without a single dramatic pause at the door. The chamber door closed behind them with a sound like a quiet exhale. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the room moved. Then everyone moved at once. The eruption was immediate and chaotic in the particular way that only a room full of powerful species who have just lost control of a situation can be chaotic. Every voice at a different frequency, every translator struggling to keep pace. The chamber's acoustic architecture bouncing 17 different languages off its asteroid walls, until it sounded less like a diplomatic summit and more like a geological event. Sarathvel was on his feet before the door had finished closing. His fibers had gone deep red, fury poorly contained. "They cannot simply leave," he said, his translated voice sharp as cut glass. "This is a recognized summit under Council Charter. Departure without formal declaration is a violation." "Of what exactly?" asked the Sorathi senior delegate, a creature named Wren of the Still Waters, whose 6 pale eyes had not moved from the door since Osa walked through it. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the noise the way a blade cuts, without effort. "Which charter provision requires a species to remain at a table where inequitable terms are being proposed?" "The provisional clause is standard developmental framework." "Show me," Wren said, "where it was applied to the H-Wren when they were 200 years spacefaring. Show me where it was applied to any species in this room." That produced a new silence, briefer than the last one, more uncomfortable. Chorus of 17 raised one of its 17 semi-independent sub-voices, a procedural call for order that by ancient tradition required everyone to stop speaking immediately. The room obeyed. The old Drenny's harmonics settled over the chamber like a heavy cloth. "We must address the immediate situation," Chorus of 17 said. "The human delegation has departed. The question before this body is how to proceed." "We send someone after them," Sarathvel said immediately. "The summit is not concluded. Their absence must be formally noted." "They are already gone." The voice came from a junior aide near the back of the chamber, a small Atren staffer who immediately looked as if she wished she hadn't spoken. But the words hung in the recycled air. Every head turned toward the docking bay monitoring station built into the chamber's side wall. A junior council technician pulled up the feed with shaking hands. Bay 7, assigned to the human delegation. The display showed an empty dock. The magnetic clamp seals were still warm from the shuttle's departure. The ship had left less than 4 minutes after the delegation walked out of the chamber. They had been packed before the session even began. The room absorbed this. It meant they had made the decision before they walked in that morning. The moment of standing, the closing of the folder, the buttoning of the jacket, none of it had been impulsive. It had been a conclusion delivered at the precise moment it was most clearly understood. The council had been given a performance, a perfectly measured one. "Pull their communication channels," Sarathvel ordered his staff. "All human diplomatic channels are currently in passive receive mode," his communications officer reported after a moment. "No active transmissions, no open negotiation lines. They haven't sent a message to anyone." "What about Earth's governmental frequency?" "Also passive receive." Another aide, this one from the Drenny administrative staff, spoke up carefully. "Presiding voice, I've checked our records. In 400 summits over 3,000 years of council history, no delegation has departed in this manner. Every prior withdrawal involved at minimum a formal declaration of intent, a stated grievance list, and a designated point of contact for ongoing communication." "The humans left none of those things?" Chorus asked. "They left a politely worded thank you and a parking authorization for the shuttle dock that they apparently pre-cleared before the session began this morning." The chamber was very quiet. Sarathvel's fibers cycled through 3 colors in rapid succession before settling on the flat gray of someone working very hard to appear calm. "They planned this," he said. It was not a question. "Of course they planned it," Wren of the Still Waters said. She was still looking at the door. "The question you should be asking, Ambassador, is not how to retrieve them. The question is what they know that made them confident enough to walk away from this table without a single safeguard in place." She finally turned her 6 pale eyes away from the door and looked at Sarathvel with an expression that translated poorly across species, but was universally readable as concern. "Because they didn't look afraid," she said, "not even slightly." Part 4, What Intelligence Reports Back. The Council's Joint Intelligence Division was not supposed to conduct active analysis on member species without formal authorization from the full chamber. There was a protocol. There was always a protocol. Sarathvel submitted the authorization request at midnight and had it approved by dawn, which given the Council's usual administrative pace was essentially instantaneous, a sign of how badly the walkout had rattled the senior members. By the following morning, 7 intelligence teams from 4 species were pulling everything available on humanity. What they found took 3 days to compile. What it meant took considerably longer to accept. The lead analyst on the Velkari team was a creature named Das, who had spent 40 years studying emerging civilizations and had never once been surprised by one. Das was surprised now. He delivered his report to Sarathvel in person rather than transmitting it, which was itself unusual enough that Sarathvel's aide cleared the room before Das began speaking. Humanity, Das explained, had spent their 211 years in space doing something that no species on record had done at their developmental stage. They hadn't expanded aggressively. They hadn't formed alliances or sought patronage from older civilizations. They hadn't rushed to plant flags on every habitable rock within reach. What they had done, quietly, systematically, without announcing it, was build. Not weapons, infrastructure. Their supply chain network was redundant to a degree that Velkari analysts initially mistook for inefficiency. Every major human station had 3 independent resupply routes. Every colony had food production capacity for 5 years without external input. Their communication network used 17 different transmission protocols layered over each other so that disrupting any single system affected nothing. Their energy grid was distributed across so many nodes that taking out a third of them would slow things down but collapse nothing. They built everything, Das said, his fibers cycling through the pale blue of professional unease, as if they expected to be alone. Sarathvel stared at the report. They were preparing for conflict. No, Das said. That's what I initially assumed, but the military analysis says otherwise. Their defense posture is strong but not aggressive. It's designed to make invasion prohibitively expensive, not to project power outward. This infrastructure isn't war preparation. He paused. It's independence preparation. The trade analysis was worse. Human shipping lanes, it turned out, did not follow Council-recognized corridors. They had built their own, threading through uninhabited systems and asteroid belts that Council cartography had written off as navigational nuisances. Those routes were longer in some cases, but they touched nothing that required Council authorization to use. Human commercial law didn't reference Council trade agreements. It referenced a separate body of bilateral contracts, most of them signed with smaller species who weren't Council members, or with Council members' private commercial interests operating outside official channels. The Sorathi medical mineral situation that would surface weeks later was in the report already, not as a threat, not as leverage, but as a data point. Human refinery output for 17 critical minerals exceeded Council-adjacent supply by a margin that several species had quietly come to rely on without ever formally acknowledging it. Das set the last page down. Ambassador, he said, when we wrote Article 71, we assumed that placing humanity's defense grid under Council oversight would give us influence over a young, dependent species that needed our trade routes, our arbitration, and our protection. He looked at Sarathvel directly. They don't use our trade routes. They have their own arbitration system, and it's more efficient than ours, and they are not the ones who needed protection in this arrangement. Sarathvel was quiet for a very long time. How long have they known about Article 71? He finally asked. Das checked his notes. Our best estimate based on their preparation timeline is that they identified it approximately 8 months before the summit. They said nothing. They came to the table, Das said simply. They waited to see if it would be removed before presentation. It wasn't, so they showed the room what it was and they left. He gathered his report carefully. Ambassador, in 40 years of studying developing civilizations, I have never seen one that understood its own position this clearly at this stage. He paused at the door. We made a mistake, not a strategic one, a fundamental one. We assumed that because they were young, they were unaware. He left. Sarathvel sat alone with the report for a long time, his fibers cycling slowly through the gray of someone, recalculating every assumption they had built a policy on. The Council sent its first envoy 11 days after the walkout. It was a Sorathi vessel. The Sorathi were considered the least politically charged option, their reputation for genuine neutrality being one of the few things in galactic politics that most species actually believed. The envoy carried a formal message from Chorus of 17 requesting that Ambassador Osai designate a time and channel for preliminary dialogue. They were stopped at the edge of human-monitored space by a patrol beacon, not a warship, not a weapons lock, just a calm automated voice in perfect galactic common that informed them that Ambassador Osai was unavailable for scheduling at this time. When the envoy's captain asked when she might be available, the beacon informed them that her schedule was not public information and offered directions back to neutral space. The captain asked if he could at least leave a message. "Passive receive mode is active," the beacon said pleasantly. "Your message has been logged." The Sorathi vessel returned to Oroville. The second envoy was a full diplomatic mission, this time from the Council collectively. A larger vessel, a senior delegate, and a carefully worded new proposal that had been drafted in emergency session and had notably, significantly softened the language around developmental oversight. They were received at a human border station with the kind of hospitality that immediately made the delegation nervous. Excellent food, comfortable quarters, a lounge with a genuinely impressive view of a nearby nebula, and staff who were unfailingly polite and entirely uncommunicative about anything of substance. They waited, days passed. On the fourth day, they asked about scheduling. They were told that the ambassador was engaged with other matters, but that their comfort was a priority. On the seventh day, they asked again. They were told the same thing. On the 11th day, a pleasant human liaison named Chen appeared, thanked them sincerely for their patience, and informed them that Earth's government had reviewed the Council's revised proposal and found that it did not currently address any active agenda items on their diplomatic calendar, but that the proposal had been noted and appreciated. "When will it address active agenda items?" the senior council delegate asked. Chen smiled with perfect professional warmth. "We'll be in touch." They were escorted to their ship with the same impeccable courtesy with which they'd arrived. The third envoy was Velkari, sent privately without council authorization. Sarathvel had made the decision alone, convinced that a direct approach, species to species, power to power, would cut through what he privately characterized as humanity's deliberate obstruction. He sent a senior Velkari diplomat in a fast ship, with instructions to make contact at any level of human government they could reach, even informally. The ship crossed into human space without incident. It was immediately met by a human patrol vessel, not a military vessel. Technically, the human registry listed it as a border coordination craft that matched their speed exactly and held formation off their port side. No weapons charged, no demands made. The patrol craft simply flew alongside them, maintaining perfect distance, its running lights calm and steady. When the Velkari ship attempted to accelerate, the patrol craft accelerated. When it slowed, the patrol craft slowed. When it attempted to change heading toward the nearest human station, the patrol craft moved, still without any aggressive action, still with no weapons engaged, to a position that would have required physically passing through it to continue. They turned around. The patrol craft accompanied them back to the border in perfect silence, then peeled off and returned to its patrol route as if nothing had happened. Back on Oroville, the Council received these reports in a meeting that went 4 hours over its scheduled time. The frustration in the room was palpable, but underneath the frustration was something else, something that Wren of the Still Waters noticed and filed away carefully. None of the human responses had been hostile, not one. There had been no threatening transmissions, no military buildups detected along human borders, no propaganda, no public statements of grievance. Humanity had not complained to anyone, had not sought allies, had not raised its voice. They were simply unavailable. And somehow that was more unnerving than any ultimatum could have been. The disruptions began quietly, the way most important things begin, not as emergencies, but as inconveniences that gradually revealed themselves to be structural problems. The first report came from the Atren Confederacy's Logistics Division. A regular cargo run through the Tessavar corridor was taking 11 days longer than scheduled. The Tessavar corridor ran adjacent to human-monitored space, and the private shipping company that operated it, a small outfit that nobody at the council level had ever paid attention to, had apparently been using informal docking agreements with human stations for resupply and maintenance. Those agreements, it seemed, were in passive review pending diplomatic developments. The Atren filed a complaint with their shipping company. The shipping company filed a request with the Human Commercial Liaison Office. The Human Commercial Liaison Office sent a polite acknowledgement and noted that all external agreements were currently under standard review. Estimated timeline unavailable. The second report, 2 weeks later, came from the Sorathi Medical Authority. A mineral compound called Vel-7, used in the synthesis of Sorathi neurological medications that treated a condition affecting roughly 12% of their population, was experiencing a supply shortage. Vel 7 refinement was technically possible at 3 facilities in known space. 2 were Sorathi-operated, but had been running below capacity following equipment failures 6 months prior. The third was on a human orbital station called Meridian 9. Meridian 9 was still operating. Meridian 9 was still refining Vel 7. Meridian 9 was, however, honoring only contracts that had been signed before the summit. New purchase orders were in queue, estimated processing time, subject to ongoing review. The Sorathi government moved quickly. Their ambassador to human space made a direct call, not to the council, not through diplomatic channels, but to the commercial management office of Meridian 9 itself. A human manager named Ashford answered, confirmed that the Sorathi's medical situation was understood and taken seriously, and said that expedited processing could be arranged through a bilateral commercial agreement signed directly between the Sorathi Medical Authority and Meridian 9's parent company. Not through the council, directly. The Sorathi signed within 48 hours. The Vel 7 orders processed the next day. The council was not informed until after the fact. Then the Lurath trade data surfaced. The Lurath were a small species, not powerful enough to merit much council attention, which was precisely why the data was so revealing. For 11 years, the Lurath had been quietly trading raw biological materials, nothing regulated, nothing strategic, through human commercial brokers who had apparently been operating a perfectly functional and surprisingly sophisticated trade network that touched dozens of minor species entirely outside council oversight. The network wasn't secret, it was just small enough that the council had never looked at it. When an analyst pulled the full scope of it at the council's request, the map that emerged covered 63 species, 400 trade routes, and a volume of commerce that was, by modest estimate, equivalent to 14% of all council-regulated interspecies trade. 14%, built in 211 years by a species at the bottom tier. The room where the report was presented went very quiet. Wren of the Still Waters looked at the map for a long time. Then she said something that nobody in the room contradicted. They weren't building leverage. They were building a civilization. We just assumed that because it was their civilization, it couldn't matter to ours. She looked around the table. It matters. The Velkari's economic team submitted a private assessment the same week. It was classified, but its conclusions were stark. If humanity formalized its parallel trade networks into an independent commercial framework and invited council-adjacent species to join it, they could draw enough economic activity away from council-regulated routes to meaningfully alter the political balance of the outer systems within a decade. Humanity had not threatened to do this. Humanity had not mentioned it at all, but the infrastructure existed. It had always existed. The Council, for the first time, began to understand the difference between a species that was dependent on them and a species that had simply chosen, so far, to be polite. It came without warning, no press release, no advance notice to Council channels, no diplomatic prelude of any kind. One morning, 43 days after the walkout, every species in known space with a receiver capable of picking up the standard galactic broadcast frequency received the same transmission simultaneously. A human woman, a plain background, no flags, no insignia, no diplomatic staging. Just Ambassador Yara Os sitting in what appeared to be an ordinary office, speaking directly into a camera as if she were talking to someone across a table. She spoke for 9 minutes and 22 seconds. She did not raise her voice once. She began by saying that she wanted to be honest, because she found that most diplomatic situations suffered from an excess of careful language and a shortage of honest conversation, and she thought the current situation had gone on long enough that honesty was owed to everyone. She said that humanity had come to the summit on Oroville with a genuine intention to negotiate. She said that her team had read the proposed treaty thoroughly and had found it, in several areas, to be a thoughtful framework for interspecies cooperation. She said there were clauses in it that humanity would have signed without hesitation. Then she talked about Article 71. She didn't use legal language. She described it the way she would describe it to someone who had never heard of the Council, never attended a summit, never navigated the dense thicket of interstellar diplomatic protocol. A clause, she said, that would have placed Earth's ability to defend itself under the authority of a committee that humanity had no meaningful power within, for 150 years, for the stated reason that humanity was too young to be trusted with its own security. She paused there. She said she wanted to be precise about something. She was not angry. Anger, she said, was a response to surprise, and nothing about Article 71 had surprised her. What she felt was something simpler and more durable than anger: clarity. She said humanity had spent 2 centuries in space learning one lesson above all others, and that lesson was that no civilization could outsource its own dignity. Not to a stronger neighbor, not to a governing body, not to a committee with a rotating chairmanship, and a consensus mechanism designed to produce outcomes favorable to whoever had the most votes. She said humanity wished peace with every species in known space. She meant it, she said, not as a diplomatic formula but as an actual, considered position. Peace was better, trade was better, cooperation was better. Humanity was not leaving the galaxy. Humanity was not building walls. Humanity was simply not going to sign a document that treated them as a problem to be managed rather than a people to be respected. Then she said something that the Council's translation teams would spend weeks arguing about, not because it was ambiguous, but because its simplicity made them certain they must have missed something. She said, "We will return to the table when the table is ready for us. We are not hard to find." She thanked everyone for listening. The broadcast ended. For about 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then the Council's communication infrastructure lit up, not with human signals, but with the Council's own member species contacting each other in a volume and urgency that the system's routing architecture had not been designed to handle simultaneously. Within 2 hours, 14 of the 17 Council species had opened internal governmental discussions about the summit. Within 24 hours, 3 formal Council member petitions had been filed requesting a review of the treaty's foundational clauses. Within 48 hours, the Velkari Diplomatic Office released a brief, carefully worded statement saying that they welcomed ongoing dialogue about treaty frameworks. It was the first time in the Velkari Dominion's history that they had publicly characterized a treaty they had authored as open to revision before ratification. Nobody mentioned that a 9-minute speech delivered from an ordinary office with no production value, no dramatic music, and no political theatrics had done what 6 weeks of council meetings and 3 failed diplomatic missions could not. Nobody needed to. Wren of the Still Waters watched the broadcast twice. After the second viewing, she sat quietly for a while. Then she contacted her government and said 4 words before ending the transmission: "Fix the treaty, completely." The new session was scheduled for a neutral date, no ceremonial significance, no anniversary of any prior treaty. Just a date chosen because it was soon enough to matter and far enough out to allow preparation. The Chamber of Oroville had been reconfigured, quietly and without public announcement, so that all 17 tiers were at the same elevation. There was no bottom anymore. Humanity's tier was still in its original position, but it was the same height as everyone else's now. 3 months had passed since the walkout. In that time, the Velkari's lead ambassador to the summit had been replaced. Sarathvel had retired from active diplomatic service, officially for health reasons. The new draft treaty was shorter than the original by 400 pages. It had no provisional clauses. It had no developmental oversight mechanisms. It had a clear mutual defense framework, equitable trade lane designations, and a dispute resolution process that gave every signatory equal standing regardless of how long they'd been spacefaring. Article 71 did not exist in any form. The legal team that had originally drafted it had been quietly reassigned. The chamber was full when the session opened. Every delegation had arrived early. Nobody wanted to be seen arriving after the humans, for reasons that nobody stated openly, but everyone understood. Chorus of 17 opened the session with a significantly abbreviated procedural statement, 12 minutes instead of 4 hours. The chamber's acoustic system seemed somehow better calibrated than it had been before, the translations cleaner, the background noise reduced. Small details. The kind of care that went into a room where people wanted things to go well. Then the door opened. Yara Osa walked in at the exact scheduled time, not early, not late, exactly on time, with Calloway on her left and Mwangi on her right. She was wearing the same dark charcoal suit. Her hands were empty. She carried no folder this time, no document case, no data tablet. She walked to Humanity's tier and sat down. She looked at the chamber. Not with triumph, there was nothing triumphant in her expression, and every species in the room who studied her was looking for it. What was there was something harder to name. Recognition, perhaps. The particular quality of attention that a person gives a situation they have thought about carefully and are now seeing clearly. She looked at the treaty displayed on her console, the new version, the short version, the one without the cage built into it. She read it at the same pace she read everything, which was to say completely. No one rushed her. No one spoke. The chamber held its silence the way it held its recycled air without effort, because that was simply what the space required right now. After a while, she looked up. "I have some questions about Section 9, she said. "The patrol boundary language could be more specific." Wren of the Still Waters leaned forward. "We thought so too. We left it deliberately open for discussion." "Good," Osai said. And they began. What followed was 4 days of work, actual work, the detailed grinding negotiation of exact language and specific provisions and technical clauses that nobody outside a treaty chamber ever heard about, but that determined how things actually functioned for the next 100 years. It was not dramatic. It was not televised. It was not, most of the time, particularly exciting. But it was honest, and that made it faster than anyone expected. On the morning of the 4th day, the final text was ready. One by one, the delegations reviewed it and indicated approval. When it was humanity's turn, Mwangi projected it on her tablet, and she and Calloway read it one final time while Osai sat quietly. Then Osai signed it. She signed it last, not as a symbolic statement, but because she'd asked for that position at the start and nobody had objected. Signing last meant reading everything that came before. Signing last meant you saw the whole document before you committed to it. When it was done, Chorus of 17 announced the treaty concluded and offered the traditional closing statement. The chamber applauded in whatever physical manner each species used to indicate approval. Osa gathered nothing because she had brought nothing. She stood, exchanged quiet words with Wren of the Still Waters, nodded to Chorus of 17, and walked toward the door. Calloway fell into step beside her. "Was it what you hoped for?" he asked quietly. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "It was what it should have been the first time," she said. They walked out of the chamber and into the corridor of Oroville, where the stars outside the porthole windows were the same stars they had always been, indifferent, ancient, burning with the same patient fire that had been burning since long before any species in that chamber had learned to look up and wonder. They had not won by fighting. They had not won by threatening. They had won by knowing exactly who they were and refusing, quietly and completely, to be anything less. The ship home was booked for that evening. Osai had already asked the crew to leave on time. She had work to do,